Open source is a way for people to collaborate on software without being encumbered by all of the problems of intellectual property, having to negotiate contracts every time you buy a piece of software, have a lot of lawyers involved. In general, we just want to get the software to work, and we want to be able to have people contribute fixes to that, etc. So we sort of sacrifice some of the intellectual property rights and just let the whole world use the software.
Where did the ideas that led to what is now called open source, how did that begin? Who began that?
Well, it actually began with the start of computers, because at that time, software was just passed around between people. And I think it was only like in the late 70s, early 80s, that people started really closing up their software and saying, no, you can never get a look at the source code. You can't change this software, even if it's necessary for you to fix it for your own application. And you can actually blame some of that on Microsoft. They were one of the real pioneers of the proprietary software model.
In the mid-1970s, a group of hackers and computer hobbyists in Silicon Valley formed the Homebrew Computer Club. In the club's January 31st, 1976 newsletter, Bill Gates of the recently formed Microsoft wrote an open letter to the community where he made a point-by-point argument for the relatively new concept of proprietary software. Up to that point, the practice of computer users had been to freely pass around software with not much thought given to its ownership. Known as an open letter to hobbyists, Bill Gates writes, "To me, the most critical thing in the hobby market right now is the lack of good software courses, books, and software itself. Without good software and an owner who understands programming, a hobby computer is wasted. Will quality software be written for the hobby market?" Gates goes on to write, "The feedback we have gotten from the hundreds of people who say they are using BASIC has all been positive. Two surprising things are apparent, however. One, most of these users never bought BASIC, and two, the amount of royalties we have received from sales to hobbyists makes the time spent on Altair BASIC worth less than $2 an hour. Why is this? As the majority of hobbyists must be aware, most of you steal your software. Hardware must be paid for, but software is something to share. Who cares if the people who worked on it get paid? Is this fair? One thing you don't do by stealing software is get back at MITS for some problem you may have had. MITS doesn't make money selling software. One thing you do is prevent good software from being written. Who can afford to do professional work for nothing? What hobbyist can put 3-man years into programming, finding all bugs, documenting his product, and distribute it for free? The fact is, no one besides us has invested a lot of money in hobby software. What about the guys who resell Altair BASIC? Aren't they making money on hobby software? Yes, but those who have been reported to us may lose in the end. They are the ones who give hobbyists a bad name and should be kicked out of any club meeting they show up at. I would appreciate letters from anyone who wants to pay up or has a suggestion or comment. Signed, Bill Gates, General Partner, Microsoft."
Free software generally does have a copyright, it does have an owner, and it has a license. It is not public domain. Well, the license I use is the GNU General Public License. That's the one that Richard Stallman wrote, and I think it's a really astounding contribution. It's one of the few software licenses that was written from the standpoint of the community rather than from the standpoint of protecting a company or, as is the case with the MIT and the BSD license, performing the goals of a government grant program. And the GPL is really unique in that it's not just a license, it's a whole philosophy that I think motivated the open source definition. I don't hide that a lot of what I do came from Stallman. The reason Netscape is important is that they were the first large company to participate in open source. We had Cygnus providing support, but we didn't really have much business. And Netscape went to open source essentially as a way to fight Microsoft, which was giving away Internet Explorer, but not letting anyone else have the source code, not letting companies collaborate.
Working as part of the sales force, I got a good idea of why people bought our software and what it took to make our software successful in the marketplace against competitive products. However, the problem we were seeing is that as time went on, our software was being competed against by other people's software, particularly Microsoft's, And as time went on, the price of our software had to drop because other people were giving their software away at no charge or at little charge.
No, the real problem was that they feared that Microsoft would achieve a monopoly lock on the browser market, and they would then use that monopoly lock to pervert, actually, the HTTP and HTML standards that the web depends on. And once they had turned those standards into lock-in devices, they could then use that control to drive Netscape out of the server market, which is where it was making its real money.
My concern was that as time went on, Netscape's business would be threatened by the fact that we didn't have enough people to do all the things we needed to do as a company in order to keep our software viable in the marketplace.
The Netscape release happened in early 1998, and I was told later, I had no idea at the time, that it came about as a direct result of the right people having read The Cathedral and the Bazaar.
The Cathedral and the Bazaar, the paper by Eric Raymond, was a significant influence on Netscape's decision to release source code.
Came as a complete shock to me. I wasn't really ready for the thought that I was changing the world, even by accident.
However, it was not by any means the only influence on that decision, and not necessarily the most important one when all is said and done. As I said, Netscape had already been talking about releasing source code for quite some time before anybody had ever heard of Eric's paper.
Linux Congress in early 1997, which was the first place that I gave that paper. And one of the people who heard it was Tim O'Reilly of O'Reilly Associates. And he thought it was pretty intriguing. And he asked me to give it at his first Perl conference, which was later that year in fall of 97. And apparently what happened, I was told later, although I had no idea this was happening at the time, is that some people from Netscape actually heard the paper at the Perl conference and took those ideas back to Netscape, and they kind of lit a fire there.
The role of my paper was essentially to make the internal case at Netscape, to make the business case for why Netscape should release its source code. The paper was called Netscape Source Code as Netscape Product. A strange title. Essentially, what the title meant was that, in my opinion, we needed to think of source code not just as something that was used in creating our products, but as something that was a product in its own right, something that customers might use, that other people might use. I then looked at what the business models might be if we release source code for our products. How would we license them? How would we sell products in this environment? Then I looked at the competition, particularly Microsoft. What would they be likely to do if we release source code? Was there some way they could use our source code against us? I used Eric's paper as an example of how distributed development could work, how a company could develop software not just using their own people, but also working with people on the internet. And that's why I included a reference to Eric's paper in my paper. Once my paper was circulated, the people who read my paper would naturally enough find a reference to Eric's paper and read that as well.
And who was involved in making that happen at Netscape?
Primarily, the person who made the actual decision was Jim Barksdale. And this turned out to be important later, that our big win, the big score that gave us mainstream visibility and credibility with investors, came not because of bottom-up evangelism from a bunch of engineers, but because one strategist at the top saw the potential power of this method and then essentially imposed that vision on everyone underneath him.
When I completed the paper, I first gave a copy to Mark Andreessen, who was co-founder of Netscape and was at the time in the senior management team at Netscape. Mark then gave a copy of the paper to several other people within Netscape management, including Jim Barksdale. I'm not sure exactly when Jim and the other senior managers made the actual decision. I believe it was in early January sometime. Netscape actually announced that it was going to release the source code on January 22nd, at the same time that they released that they were going to give Communicator away for free. When Netscape decided to release the source code, people sort of got a wake-up notice that said, hey, maybe there is something to this idea of releasing source code and doing development with people outside your company. So Netscape's decision brought a lot of public attention to the idea of free software, what became known as open source, and brought a lot of attention to the Linux operating system, which was one of the most prominent examples of open source software at that time.
This is our first office, Mountain View, California. We moved here in early 1995. This is 4,000 square feet. It was an incredible leap of faith for us to move out and take the company to our own office. Now, what's really important about this place is that this is the office where the term open source was invented.
If you walk into an executive's office and you say, free software, okay, if you're lucky, the response you'll get is something like, free software must be cheap, shoddy, worthless. And if you're not lucky, it has associations with the Free Software Foundation's wholesale attack on intellectual property rights, which, regardless of what you think about the ethics of that, it's lousy marketing. It's not something that businesses want to hear.
So Eric Raymond knew that there was a problem. We'd been calling this free software, but people took the term free and associated with free of charge. They thought that you couldn't make money or you couldn't sell, which is exactly the wrong concept. We wanted to get across the idea that the software was open and that the source code was available. Very important pieces. We had this meeting at the VA offices in Mountain View where Eric, myself, and Christine Peterson from the Forsyth Institute joined us, as well as several other people.
Christine Peterson was there by phone. John Mad Dog Hall was also there by phone. A guy named Todd Anderson, who later worked for SUSE for a while, was there. Sam Achman, who now runs Penguin Computing, was there. He was an employee of VA at the time.
Well, we came up with the concept of open source. We called Linus, in fact, and asked Linus if he liked it. He was interested. He liked it. Eventually, we came up with something that replaced free software. So that was the beginning of open source.
How did you choose the words open source? Do you remember?
You know, I think Christine Peterson was the person who really came up with the idea. We wanted, again, the idea that the source code was out there and it was open. There weren't many choices.
But I think some of the people in the free software camp are a little scared by the commercialization. And, you know, of course, a rebel is put off by success. I think that commercialization is very important. We want to mainstream this software. And I work with Richard Stallman, who's the gray-haired man of free software, on a regular basis. And I don't feel I have any philosophical differences. Me as author of the open source definition, and he is originator of free software as an organized thing, except for one thing. Richard wants all software to be free, and I think that free software and non-free software should coexist. That's the only difference we have.
We decided early on that what we needed a definition. We needed a kind of meta license to define the term open source. And what we came up with is a document called the Open Source Definition. It's derived from the Debian Free Software Guidelines that were originally written by Bruce Perens.
I had written the original draft of that, discussed it for a month with the Debian developers. Debian is a Linux distribution, and made it their project policy. And Eric and I decided to relabel what we'd written for Debian as the open source definition, and to say open source is software that gives you a list of 9 rights, which is in the open source definition. The first right is free redistribution. This doesn't mean free as in no price, it means liberty. You have to be free to redistribute your software to someone else, and actually no price is a side effect. You can charge for that redistribution or not. It has to come with source code so that someone can maintain a program. If they go from a PC to a Mac, for example, they can change the software. Derived works have to be possible. If someone has to improve your program, they should be able to distribute the result. There's a provision about integrity of the author's source code, which says that the author can sort of maintain their honor, and if you make a change, you might have to change the name of the program or mark out your change very clearly so that your change doesn't reflect on the author. There's no discrimination against people or groups. The example I usually use is you can't stop an abortion clinic or an anti-abortion activist from using the software. There's no discrimination against fields of endeavor, and that means the software has to be usable in a business as well as in a school. The license has to be distributable. In other words, I have to be able to give that license to someone, and that license then should work if that someone gives it to yet a third person. The license can't be specific to a product. In other words, if I distribute my software on a Red Hat system, the license can't say, you can't distribute this on a SUSE or a Debian system. The license can't contaminate other software. So if I distribute this on a CD with another program, it can't say that other program must be free, otherwise you can't distribute my software. And then the only other part of the open source definition is a list of licenses that were accepted. And the ones that we started with were the GPL, which was actually the example for a lot of what's in the open source definition, the BSD license, because software for BSD system pre-existed Linux.
I think the next moment that I thought was really pivotal was when the database vendors flipped over, which happened about 3 months sooner than I expected it to. It actually happened in late July, early August, that we got commitments to do Tier 1 ports from Oracle and Sybase and the other key database vendors.
And why was that critical?
Because we knew that in order for the open source story to be credible, and especially in order for the Linux story to be credible, we'd have to get commitments from independent software vendors to do ports of their applications to these platforms. And I was actually kind of worried. I felt that we were in a window of vulnerability between the time that we announced the open source campaign and the database vendors flipped over. That was the point at which hostile action by Microsoft or other closed source software companies, that was the point at which a serious marketing blitz might actually have sunk us. But once the big database vendors flipped over, that opened the way for other ISVs. That started a snowball effect going.
Every 6 months or so, I would come back to the venture capitalists and I would show them the new numbers, showing more and more people adopting Linux, the new people porting, new users, and I'd show them our customer list. And our customer list was getting much more impressive. It was people like Cisco that were beginning to appear. People like, the .com companies were starting to show up on our customer list. And eventually the venture capitalists, they kept looking at it and they kept saying, oh, we can't quite do it. Finally, Linus appeared on the cover of Fortune because there was something happening with open source. Well, at that point, the venture capitalists couldn't ignore it. They just got sick of hearing about Linux everywhere, and they got tired of me just, showing it to them every at that point, almost every week. So they decided it was time to invest, that there was something happening.
Well, I announced open source to the world on the internet. I did a lot of the early administrative work of starting the open source initiative. And I think 6 months later, I was reading the words open source in the news all the time and was totally astounded. And a year later, I believe Microsoft was talking about releasing some source code. And someone in the press asked Steve Ballmer if they were going to open source their code. And Steve Ballmer said, well, open source means more than just releasing the source code. And I realized that he had read my document and understood it and was now telling the press about this. Now, if you're like just a guy on the net who's not doing this for a job at all, and you sort of write a manifesto and it spreads out through the world, and a year later the vice president of Microsoft is talking about that, you'd think you were on drugs, wouldn't you? But that's what really happened.
Open source is not communism because it doesn't force people.
Karl Marx did not invent helping your neighbor. It's not communist to have a commons. A commons existed long before communism as a philosophy of government. There are many commons in our lives. For example, we drive on the highway, something that is maintained for our common good.
Actually, labeling our business model means that it misses the point a little bit. Whether it's communist or whether it's capitalist, the label doesn't matter. The real question is, how much value can you deliver? How scalable is the business? What kind of problems, what kind of rate of innovation can you sustain? And then however you want to label that is really up to you.